to this Transatlantic book launch in our Hot of the Presses series. The book in question is titled Humans. It's edited by Laura Bieger, Joshua Shannon, and Jason Weems, and it appeared very recently in 2022 in the Terra Foundation essay series with the University of Chicago Press. It is a book that, in a broad range of approaches, discusses topics that are also central to our mission here at the Center, in particular, its new initiative called Being Human. My name is Jeanette Kohl, and I'm one of the two directors of the Center for Ideas in Society. For those joining us for the first time, our Hot of the Presses series provides a platform for discussion of recent scholarly and creative work produced by our faculty and students. And it is, if you want, a window into our college. And I'm glad that you are here, near and far, to peep in through that window today. My welcome this morning comes from my office on campus, located on the traditional homelands of the Kawia, Tongva, Luisenyo, and Serrano peoples. We would like to respectfully acknowledge our responsibility to these caretakers of the lands and express our gratitude for having the opportunity of living and working here. I'm charged with a couple of housekeeping items, very quick. I'm trying to keep it to the basics here so you have time. This meeting will be recorded, so if you turn on your camera and unmute yourself, there's a chance that your image and voice will be recorded. We ask everyone except the panelists to please mute their microphones. Please feel free to drop questions for the panelists in the chat. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the panel for the Q&A. Closed captioning is, as always, available. You can activate it on your Zoom screen controls. And before I hand this over to Jason Weems, just a very few sentences about the center's you see, I'm using this opportunity to talk just very briefly about our new Being Human initiative. And I'll leave all the important things to Jason Weems that is talking about the book. So when Jason told me about this, and you know, we're colleagues in the same department, I was quite excited to see the publication of a book called Humans. The questions it raises are very much in line with our own endeavors here of tackling and rethinking big human questions on an interdisciplinary scale, in an effort that connects our colleges, in particular the sciences, medical and otherwise, with the arts and the humanities. So our goal is to think together rather than in intellectual silos about the human condition in times of altered pandemic realities, in times of climate change, of rising nationalisms, and now a horrific war in Europe. Being human is based on the conviction that we can only solve these problems together as humans and for humans on an unbiased international and interdisciplinary scale, reevaluating the role of our traditional academic setup of disciplines and questioning them productively. And with that, it is a pleasure to hand the event over to my friend and colleague in art history, Jason Weems, who has initiated this event and who will guide us through it with the help of the panelists in just a minute. And I think the idea here is that there will be links to all of the CVs of the panelists, including Jason's, in the chat. Catherine, I think, just dropped them there. So if you would like to know more about all the great and remarkable things that they have done, there will be links and you just click on them. And with that, Jason, I'm handing it over to you. The floor is all yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeanette, for that wonderful introduction. On behalf of the three editors who are the three editors of this volume, Human, who are myself, Laura Bieger, who is professor of American Studies at the University of Groningen, and Joshua Shannon, who is professor of modern and contemporary art at the University of Maryland. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to offer, of course, a special thanks to the UCR Center for Ideas in Society, its directors, Jeanette Kohl and Dylan Rodriguez, as well as its assistant director, Catherine Henshaw, for facilitating this event. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, which are the Research Center for the Study of Democratic Cultures and Politics at the University of Groningen, Laura Bieger, commanding officer, and the Potomac Center for the Study of Modernity at the University of Maryland, Joshua Shannon, founding director. So you could say we had those sponsorships, I guess, in the can. And I also finally want to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and the University of Chicago Press for producing this book. So without much ado, why a book entitled Humans? Like most scholarly books, the roots of the project are both global and personal. For many years now, my colleagues, Laura, Josh, and I have been joined in a debate, fantastically rewarding, occasionally frustrating, always compelling, about the methods and stakes of writing and teaching about art, American art in specifically. Now, art, of course, is a most human endeavor. And so we have really been speaking, I think, about the nature of human thought, action, and being, from those of the artist to the scholar, to the viewer, to society and its frameworks. Now, most often, perhaps, the questions raised by art historians have to do with the nature of art itself, its definitions, boundaries, purposes, capacities. And indeed, Josh, Laura, and I carried on that debate for a while. We also, of course, carried on the discipline-specific debates of American art. How, let's say, this scholar or that chooses or prefers to talk about this object or historical circumstance or that one. Yet increasingly, it dawned on us that the term most in need of discussion was not art, nor perhaps even fields and boundaries, but rather the term, concept, and notion of human or human being itself. We began to understand that the human element in art and our writing was both ubiquitous and opaque, and in fact, rarely agreed upon. Now, in some ways, the problem was, amongst other things, the closeness of the topic. Is it even possible to unwind ourselves from our own human beingness enough to study it? To put this perhaps in a medical analogy, which if no one else, at least Jeanette, I know will appreciate, the study of the human being in art, we are at once the doctor, the patient, and the practice, as well as the disease, the cure, and quite possibly the fatality. Now, as you can imagine, the stakes of conceptualizing the human being, especially when perceived in these terms, became consuming for us. And speaking only for myself, I've never so much as in this work felt the ties between my own scholarship and my responsibilities to the world of humans for which I produce it. Now, the anthology that we produced is a result of this thinking. And to describe its purpose, I want to read the first passage of the co-authored introduction, which we entitled Towards a History and Future of the Human Being in American Art. And we wrote, we wrote, of course, because we couldn't say. Human beings are organisms, but the human being is a term referring to a complicated, self-contradictory, and historically evolving set of ideas and practices. This volume explores the competing understandings of the human being that have figured into the history of American art. It's 7 essays, wonderful essays. We didn't include that part in the introduction. Consider a range of artworks from the early modern period to the present in order to assess how art has reflected, shaped, and modeled ideas of the human being in US culture and politics. How and to what extent has art promoted and circulated specific notions of humanity? And how has it helped to confer humanity on some people while withholding it from others? In what ways has art shaped the relations between humans and other beings and things? How have arts and art criticisms, constructs of the human being evolved, clashed, and intermingled with one another over the course of American history, and with what effects for human beings and both human and both non-human and inanimate others. Now, our hope in the volume is to begin telling the story of a concept that now needs serious thinking and revision. So that, in essence, is the book. And indeed, one task we took upon ourselves, I think in the intro as well as in the constitution of the book as a whole, was to construct the historiography of the human being in American art. Yet we also took on a second purpose, which I think is more important. Increasingly worried in more than an academic way about the state of humanity in a present moment warped by everything from global fascism to global environmental collapse, impending or perhaps already baked into place, we felt the need to speak not only as historians of the human being, but also as agents for shaping its future form. Writing individually, and this is the three of us towards the end of our introduction, and in what we called manifesto format, we each of us offered up some thoughts and hopes for a human, perhaps even a more human or better human tomorrow. To us as editors, I think, this was a vital process, and it represents a dialogue that we as a society and a species must have. At the same time, it was an opportunity for reflection and action that our outstanding anthology authors who were dedicated in their essays to their historical materials, did not enjoy in the same way. In essence, we had our shot, and today it's their turn. For the presentations that follow, we are excited to hear our authors share ideas on the future of the human being. We have provided them a set of 4 questions as prompts to which they may respond in any manner they choose, including, of course, not at all. And that's always the purview, I think, of any good or perhaps bad academic. And those questions are as follows. What concepts of the human are needed now? What does it mean, and what does it take to be human today? What role can art play in fostering the roles and understandings of the human being necessary now? And finally, what can we do now as scholars, as members of society, to shape humanity for the future? So quickly, in what follows, my colleague Laura will introduce and help us to greet the speakers. And then following speaker presentations, our author presentations, Josh will lead us in a Q&A that will both be first amongst the panel and then finally open to the entire audience. Because of course, you all have a stake in being human too. So without further ado, Laura.
Good idea. Microphone on, always a good idea. I just said while I was still muted. Thank you very much for hosting us here and giving us an opportunity to talk about our book. And yeah, I'm very, very, very pleased to introduce, in the order of their appearance, 5 of our 7 contributors to you. And my brief remarks will be complemented by bio blurbs with web links in the chat. So first of all, there's Alan Braddock, who's a professor of art history at William and Mary's. And he is an expert in the history of American and global art, ecology, environmental justice, and animal studies. And his contribution examines Alexander von Humboldt's representations of America in the early 19th century with regard to Humboldt's notion of humanity. Secondly, there is Jessica Horton, who's joining us from Brazil today, I hear, and we have not heard her voice in this room yet, so we hope that there will not be connectivity issues. Jessica is an associate professor of modern and contemporary art history at the University of Delaware, and her specialties are Native American art, globalization, and environmental justice. And in our volume, she explores commerce and Europe basket making in relation to colonial and US fire management policies with regard to their conflicting ideas about the human place in nature. Then there is Michael Leja, who is a professor of art history at the University of Pennsylvania. His transmedial and interdisciplinary work seeks to understand visual artifacts in relation to contemporary cultural, social, political, and intellectual developments. And it is in this spirit that his contribution detects an elite resentment against the humanity of the working and middle class audiences of this early mass-produced images that he explores. Carolyn Arscott is a professor of art history at the Courtauld Institute in London. She specializes in Victorian art and its intersections with physics and biology. And in her contribution to our volume, she considers the erasing and repainting method of James McNeill Wiltshire and its analogy to late 19th century theories of memory. And finally, Cherise Smith is a professor in African American studies at the University of Texas in Austin. She specializes in American art, the history of photography and performance and contemporary art. And in our volume, she shows how Colleen Smith's installation Remote Viewing, from which we also take our cover image, readdresses the white supremacy lurking in land art's supposedly universalist exclusion of the human figure. Not with us today due to previous commitments and family emergencies are Jean-Phillipe Antoine, who is a professor of aesthetics and contemporary art theory at Paris 8 University and also a sound artist. And having just completed a new French translation of George Kubler's The Shape of Time, his contribution exposes a disjuncture between the book's deep time anti-humanism and its speedy reception as a classicist of humanist thought. And finally, Larne Abse Gogarty is a lecturer in the history and theory of art at Slade School of Fine Arts in London. And her contribution draws our attention to the figurative paintings of the Chicago collective Monster Roaster, finding in their dark, existentially themed painting a promising alternative form of humanism. So that is our lineup today. And I'm very pleased, very happy to pass the word to Alan Braddock. Floor is yours, Alan.
Great, thank you, Laura. And thank you and Jason and Josh for including me in this fantastic book project. Thank you to my colleagues and to everyone who's out there. I thought I would actually share a couple of images, so let me do that quickly. Oops. Okay. As Laura pointed out, my essay examines the dilemma of universalism in the idea of humanity through the figure of Alexander von Humboldt, who you see here, along with today's Anthropocene concept. Humboldt was a 19th century European scientist who devised systematic universalizing methods for analyzing biophysical relationships on a planetary scale. He also voiced opposition to slavery while relying on European empire to facilitate his scientific travels and research. Humboldt regarded European science itself as an empire that could benefit everyone, including indigenous and other people he regarded as subalterns. He visualized such thinking in this allegorical frontispiece to one of his books, showing mythic Greco-Roman gods of wisdom and commerce at right, beneficently offering peace and assistance to an emblematic Native American leader amid ruins of the Spanish conquest. Towering in the background is Mount Chimborazo, which Humboldt had famously climbed, its shadows giving way to the dawn of European enlightenment. Humboldt was internationally famous during his lifetime, but his reputation languished by the late 19th century as newer scientific paradigms displaced his romantic universalism. Today, however, his star has risen again in response, in part, to planetary environmental concerns and political polarization. For many, Humboldt represents a desirable synthesis of knowledge and a commitment to the idea of universal humanity at a time of pervasive fragmentation and precarity. In that respect, Humboldt is uncannily analogous to the concept of the Anthropocene, which asserts a universal notion of human agency and culpability for today's environmental crisis, which is in many ways a crisis of environmental injustice. Much recent writing on Humboldt has paid little attention to such inequities, though, preferring instead to be celebratory, even hagiographic, despite his obvious entanglement in the politics of empire. As a way of reckoning with the obvious problems of universalism in the human and in the Anthropocene, while also confronting what I see as the dilemmas of abandoning such concepts, I conclude my essay by considering the work of a contemporary Ecuadorian artist named Fabiano Cueva, who has spent years wrestling with the legacy of Humboldt. In one work, seen here, Cueva restated the earlier allegory of European benevolence and enlightenment by placing himself in the position of Greco-Roman authority, one of many examples in which Cueva adopted and reappropriated the power of Humboldt himself. In doing so, Cueva obviously critiqued the scientist's imperial project for imposing a European standard of universal knowledge on the Americas. At the same time, by inhabiting Humboldt's position of authority, the artist also acknowledged the lingering presence of that authority. For me, Cueva's intervention smartly acknowledges his implication in the legacy of empire and the difficulty of abandoning universal concepts such as human and humanity entirely, especially at a time when historically marginalized communities still must assert their humanity against resurgent white supremacist racism and other authoritarian impulses. The Anthropocene analogy again underscores my point. As Dipesh Chakrabarty has observed, there is, quote, obvious value in our post-colonial suspicion of the universal, but the crisis of climate change calls for thinking simultaneously on both registers. Moving forward, to answer our prompt, I believe the human will remain useful for asserting a collective known as humanity, but this universalizing assertion will always need to be scrutinized critically to reveal difference and to challenge inequity. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Wonderful.
Yes,
hi.
Good to see you too, Jess. Hi.
I made it. Being human in Sao Paulo today means cursing at my laptop while tech support is on lunch break. So I'm zooming in from my phone, and I apologize that my image presentation will not accompany this. You'll have to just listen to my voice and look at my face in large. So I'm speaking to you today from the homelands of the Guarani here in Sao Paulo. I'm on a semester abroad teaching Indigenous North American art and ecology, thanks to the Terra. So a double thanks to Terra today, as well as to my editors and colleagues at this event. Thanks so much for including me in the conversation and the book. Shortly before my arrival to Brazil in late March, President Bolsonaro paid President Putin a visit, and they championed their shared approach to energy development as the occasion for deepening diplomatic ties. with the invasion of Ukraine looming, this ostentatiously timed visit brought to the fore the quieter killing fields that subtend the spectacle of war, a resource-rich Amazon and Arctic, where indigenous land claims and the fate of the biosphere hang in balance. Bolsonaro once lamented that the Brazilian army hadn't been as competent as, I quote in translation, American cavalry, which decimated its Indians in the past and today does not have this problem in the country, unquote. So a kind of annihilation by words. His comments conjure a third party to a deadly diplomatic pact, Trump, who is not quite, I'm afraid, left the scene of national or international politics, and who infamously placed a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office during his time in the presidency. So perhaps it goes without saying in a conversation about humans that leaders such as these men have throughout the modern history of this changeable term played an outsized role in defining belonging through elimination, severing groups deemed less than human and the more than human milieus that sustain this whole fragile business of life on our planet. No wonder then that the participants in Acampamento Terra Livre in Brasilia, which I had just attended last week, an annual gathering to protest the anti-indigenous and ecocidal policies of the Brazilian state, choose to wear customary feathers and paint their bodies like jungle felines, eschewing exclusionary definitions of human and nation altogether, while pointing to the broken diplomatic imaginary in which both are entangled. Now, diplomacy may seem to have no place at all in a Bolsonaro, Putin, or Trump imagined geopolitics, right? Let alone the sustained resistance to their policies, as it's often activism that takes over in a vacuum of diplomacy, right? Each of these men has been accused of trampling the international institution of diplomacy, which is premised on non-violent negotiation to maintain a so-called balance of power among nations. On the contrary, though, I've been starting to wonder whether these men don't give the clearest, most unabashed expression to a certain logic underlying modern diplomacy. For the seeming anti-diplomatic spectacle of war is but one expression of an omnipresent and deadly imbalance of power, as modern nations have, in the words of Jason Dittmer, colonized the spaces of diplomacy, expelling a multitude of cosmopolitical traditions and beings from the governance of world affairs. And it's in the ensuing vacuum that common policies of exploiting indigenous and majority world bodies and land are enacted multilaterally. I've been working recently in a forthcoming book project and various other spaces, including sort of the essay I wrote for the humans book. It's at least related, to illuminate alternative traditions of Earth diplomacy. Traditions which persist and adapt both inside and at the edges of modern international relations. Earth diplomacy names long-standing indigenous practices of engendering sensuous material exchange to build political alliances inclusive of the land. Before and throughout the colonization of the Americas, the ongoing colonization of the Americas, Native leaders have treated other than human beings and systems as diplomatic agents in their negotiations with strangers. And in these cases, art is the affective medium through which indigenous leaders shape these alliances. Rituals, regalia, and gifts have helped to forge political contracts founded on kinship and reciprocity with all aspects of the living cosmos. But art also literally makes the bodies of Earth relatives present at the negotiating table. For within Earth diplomacy, particular humans are some among many strangers, ally, and potential kin who share the planet and co-create the political relationships that determine a collective future. And thank you for your patience with my imageless sharing.
All right, shall we move on to the next? And I need to look at my own notes here. Who is next? That should be Michael.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted, but I'm okay. Now I am.
That's all right.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to be with you all here today. And thanks to Josh, Laura, and Jason for organizing this event. I hope the philosopher Michel Foucault is looking down on our discussion today and smiling, but not laughing. Near the end of his Archaeology of the Human Sciences, he announces the end of the object of the human sciences, that is, the human, a term he uses interchangeably with man. The focus on the human, he says, is a stubborn obstacle standing in the way of an imminent new form of thought. He continues, to all those who still wish to talk about man, about his reign or his liberation, to all those who still ask themselves questions about what man is in his essence, to all those who wish to take him as their starting point in their attempts to reach the truth, to all those who, on the other hand, refer all knowledge back to the truths of man himself, to all those who refuse to formalize without anthropologizing, who refuse to mythologize without demystifying, who refuse to think without immediately thinking that it is man who is thinking. To all these warped and twisted forms of reflection, we can only answer with a philosophical laugh, which means, to a certain extent, a silent one. I want to think that we here today are in fact formalizing without anthropologizing, which I take to mean theorizing without centering the human. And that we are in fact trying to think without immediately thinking about what it is, that it is humans who are thinking. So by not refusing to do these things, we are at least partly in sync with Foucault. Foucault's theory for his argument is that the category the human is an invention of the 19th century, constituted when the observation and study of the human became a central feature of modernity due to a shift in the episteme and a reconfiguration of power knowledge. The human, he says, is a rift in the order of things, one that will disappear when knowledge finds a new form. Like Foucault, I'm very happy to wave goodbye to the human and hope it will be succeeded by a better tool of knowledge. It has operated for long enough as an ideological category, bestowing natural superiority on those claiming entitlement to it. Believing oneself to harbor the distinctive features of humanity, consciousness, a soul, or an aesthetic sensibility, justified condescension or contempt toward other bipedal mammals whose distance from the bestial was considered unproven or dubious. Even worse, it justified exploitation, enslavement, and murder. My essay for the Humans volume explores a less violent example of this, the dehumanized status, the inferior mental and aesthetic faculties attributed to audiences from mass visual culture by those wishing to maintain an established cultural and social hierarchy, and by others justifiably worried by the manifestations of political populism in fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. When I was in graduate school many years ago, trying to understand what was going on with the concept of the human during the 1930s and the 1940s, Foucault was a great help to me. The pressures on the category human were immense in that time of trauma, and the human sciences were being interrogated to explain how so-called civilized humans could be responsible for the brutish, horrific, greedy behavior that brought on 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and more in the span of just over 3 decades. Their answer was to reconfigure the human as not entirely free of its bestial origins. Humans continued to be plagued, they said, by irrepressible primitive impulses and destructive drives that were opaque to consciousness and reason. Some few exceptions, specifically Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, pointed out that Enlightenment reason engendered domination and forced humankind back to anthropologically more primitive stages of social organization and behavior. The curse of irresistible progress, they wrote, is irresistible regression. Now we're in a moment when the disgrace of the human as a 19th century Western category is complete. To call oneself human is to accept guilt by association for the Anthropocene's devastation of the environment, for colonialist exploitation of people and land, for genocide, for animal cruelty, and species extinctions. If there's no longer status value in claiming to be human, then what good is it? I've noticed that when we speak of art now, we often specify that we're attending to human and non-human actors. It would be so much simpler to drop the distinction and just say actors. Thank you.
All right, passing it on to Carolyn.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for allowing us to have our shot at these questions of the future. I'm targeting that question about what it means and what it takes to be human by thinking a bit about biology. Arguments about nurture versus nature are long-standing, and we can think back to Lear's cry in Shakespeare's play for a cultural definition of humanity. Reason not the need, as he says to his daughters, arguing for a definition of humanity based on legible social identity derived from social reference groups, versus later in the play, the unaccommodated man, nothing more than the poor, bare, forked animal that he turns to when encountering the naked Edgar, poor Tom. Today, we're being nudged away from cultural definitions to biological definitions by the medical emergency. The pandemic has brought us a more than ever fractured social fabric, driving great wedges into existing lines of class distinction, as containment measures involve exploited sections of society at great personal risk, supplying, servicing, transporting and maintaining civil units, households, consumers, school children and patients. Lockdown and the still raging virus posit paradoxes in being human afresh. Where precautions are enforced, the social fabric with its regular clusters becomes unfamiliar. Families are kept apart, unable to travel and cautious about mingling. Neighbours are boxed, each into their own dwelling space. Members of the workforce in many contexts work on Zoom and never assemble. The greatest fracturing of all maps on to the inequalities of race and class. Clearly, the inoculated and the non-inoculated constitute the global haves and have-nots. And yet, along with this cultural fracturing, there is epidemiological linkage. The virus has forcibly underlined our common humanity, as plagues and epidemics have done throughout history. In the 19th century, Thomas Carlyle identified typhus as the telling plague that proved that his often invoked poor Irish widow shared a common humanity with the mean-minded charity officers of Edinburgh who refused her aid. And to quote here from Carlyle's Past and Present, the humane physician asks thereupon, as with a heart too full for speaking, would it not have been economy to help this poor widow? She took typhus fever and killed 17 of you. Very curious. The forlorn Irish widow applies to her fellow creatures as if saying, behold, I am sinking, bare of help, ye must help me. I am your sister, bone of your bone, one God made us, ye must help me. They answer, no, impossible, thou art no sister of ours. But she proves her sisterhood, her typhus fever kills them. They actually were her brothers, though denying it. So that's from Carlyle's Past and Present. For all his anti-democratic politics, Carlyle mobilizes the terms and rhetorics of the 18th and 19th century anti-slavery campaign with its refusal of a theory of polygenesis whereby non-European races had separate origins and were not of the same species. A singular cohesive humanity biologically linked was the predicate of the abolitionist slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Since 2020, we are in a phase again where the nature point of view seems to trump nurture. In the US and the UK, the right-wing establishment is calling for social behavior to go back to normal, inverted commas normal, abandoning all safeguards and mitigations, envisioning a resumption of life in which structural divisions can be disguised or occluded to some extent by the buzz of family, town, and office life, with a good measure of patriotic nationalism being brought into play. In writing about Whistler for this volume, I realized that Whistler was taking the radical step of envisioning a core humanity, biological in conception. This is not to say that Whistler's politics were radical. Just as much as Carlyle, his views were apparently anti-democratic and racist. It was, however, radical to develop a pictorial repertoire to approach these biological aspects of the human mind, which were of increasing interest in the mid-19th century to a group of philosophical and medical specialists. Interestingly, his human figures could look rather alien. The nearest comparators seem to be Gothic fiction and 20th century science fiction. I found I had to invoke the macabre fantasies of Edgar Allan Poe and the post-human vat-grown androids of Rudy Rucker. Whistler's sustained project of painting nighttime scenes, his nocturnes, takes him to unpeopled cityscapes. Whistler posits that biological processes of mind, memory, subjectivity, and mortality are picturable in some way, and that pictures can be made even with the omission of familiar cultural reference points concerning human action, ethics, and motivation. And without visualizing the clusters of our world, whether court or cottage, whether the ceremonies of social consensus or the gatherings of dissent. His pictures address the human partly through the abiding concern with personal identity, some might say the insistent egotism of his entire project. What I found was that his figureless scenes might be said to address the biological substrate of human identity, not obviously human in terms of motif, but certainly taking on the question of being human. Thank you.
Excellent. And now finally, our last speaker, Cherise.
Hi, good morning here in California to everyone. Thanks for coming out, and congratulations to Laura, Jason, and Joshua for the book, and my co-authors, co-chapter contributors. So I'm just going to read a couple of passages from my chapter, and then I will talk a little bit more. In the winter of 2011, Colleen Smith's work was featured in an exhibition. I forgot to show you my image. I'm sorry. Let me do that first. Sorry, guys. All right. In the winter of 2011, Colleen Smith's work was featured in an exhibition titled Remote Viewing and Other Ways of Seeing at the Kitchen in New York. Curated by Rashida Bumbray, the exhibition featured Smith's videos projected on 2 large screens on adjacent walls in a black box space. At left, the grid records a Black woman and man creating a temporary grid of hot pink tape across a dry Southern California landscape, in which an old oak tree figures prominently. The central screen displayed the nearly 15-minute long video Remote Viewing, which variously features a multi-story square green screen, a Black boy and woman, a schoolhouse, and an excavator in the Southern California landscape, a more institutional one. The videos on the 2 large screens could masquerade as land art. Their grid patterns, piles of dirt, and earth movers sampled the gestures and visual language of canonical works by artists Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson. Visitors to the exhibition could intuit that the grid and remote viewing meditated on land, the landscape, and land art. Yet the artist's inclusion of African-American figures in the works complicates such a reading. In what follows, I consider remote viewing and the manner in which Smith's strategic inclusion of human figures of Black people focuses attention on the contradictions within the intellectual discourses with which land art is associated. On the one hand, land art has been aligned with universal humanism, a foundational principle of Western culture that has invested white men with power and authority over the land and those who live on it. On the other hand, land art propagates anti-humanism with its hubristic, and mechanized alteration of the earth without regard for the history, culture, and well-being of disempowered people. Put more finely, remote viewing emphasizes the closeness between a universalizing humanism and its white supremacy by highlighting how Heiser's and Smithson's whiteness and maleness, specifically race and just gendered positionalities, have been regarded as normal and universal positions. Smith's addition of Black figures in remote viewing humanizes the landscape at the same time that it undermines the universal anti-human dyad at land art's heart. Drawing on the genre's well-worn tropes, including admiration for the beauty of found land, applause for the metamorphosis wrought by creative genius, and wonder at the creator's mastery over the earth, Smith's presentation of Black people in the land, in a landscape, in an environment, and in land art actions forces viewers to see and think differently. In my chapter, you will see me look carefully at and read closely the artwork, even as I'm providing a social historical context. In that way, I'm demonstrating respect for the work as art, drawing attention to the intellect and agency of its artists. Artist Charles Gaines' exhibition and catalog, The Theater of Refusal, teaches us that minoritized artists, rather than their artworks, often become the objects of analysis for certain critics. Keeping those problems front and center in my mind and in my writing, I performed an analysis of the tropes associated with land art and the social histories they implicate. This matters because the field of art history continues to be challenged to make space for certain art, particular artists, and the art historians who produce knowledge about them. Art history continues a dependence on pillars of whiteness. Let me quote my esteemed colleague and friend, Eddie Chambers, who in his Small Acts article, The Difficulty of Naming White Things, put the problem succinctly. It seemed to me that there were things and there were Black things. There was history and then there was Black history. There was art and there was Black art. Simply put, white people didn't need to prefix their stuff as white art, white history, white memorabilia, because history, art, memorabilia, and a host of other things carried with them in the single unracialized or deracialized word abundant references to and presumptions of whiteness and white people. Still quoting here. Time and again, I find myself returning to the knotty question of the difficulty of naming white things, and by extension, the pitfalls of naming Black things. If that, art history, which is white and unnamed, is central, then it follows that the art history, that art history, which is Black and named, must by extension exist in some sort of peripheral or secondary space. Chambers' point is clear. So-called microaggressions keep minoritized art, artists, and art historians on the margins while buttressing whiteness's presence at the discipline's center. My chapter in the Humans book considers how an artist makes work that calls us toward material change on an unequal playing field and in a discipline whose raison d'etre is to categorize, discriminate, and hold up what has already been deemed valuable. Colleen Smith produces art that understands that visual culture and art are serious, constructed products that wield power, that contest and enforce hierarchies, that endeavor toward equity. The Humans book continues the project of expanding art and art history by offering models of a relevant art history, one that teaches us to think critically about our environment and to act toward equity. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of
I'm assuming, right, Josh is taking over.
Oh, I'll take the baton gracelessly from Laura and just say on behalf of her and Jason how grateful we are to the 7 authors and the 5 of you who are able to present today for these contributions to this investigation of the concept of the human being in the history of American culture and American art. And I have to say, I'm really pleased with what all of you just added and with the very idea of having us get together in this format, because I think each of you has demonstrated a way to think about your contribution in connection, not only to its historical moment, but to the moment of the present. That is to say, how does this historical theorization and understanding of the idea of the human bear on the kind of human beings that we imagine can create a civilization going forward that is sustainable and just. And I think, you know, it's worth just saying explicitly, I'm sure I speak for many, many gathered people if I say, I think the question over, the big question overhanging the gathering is, if we've done this kind of historical thinking, what can we as academics in the humanities now do in our teaching and our writing, our time with students and our time with each other, that could help produce the kind of thought that would make a civilization in the coming decades and centuries that is, in fact, can sustain itself and can sustain itself as just. I'm also really grateful that a couple of things came out in a slightly more pointed way than maybe they do in the volume. And so I want to pull on those to open our discussion. And let me say first that we will be opening the discussion in less than 10 minutes to everyone gathered. So as I'm going to direct a question or two to the panelists who just spoke, but as they're answering those questions, I encourage you please to go ahead and type questions you have into the chat. You could just put in a few words if you want, because what I'll do is I'll call on you and invite you to say your question out loud for a discussion among everyone gathered. But let me begin at the wonderful spot where Cherise left off, which is with Eddie Chambers' remarkable expression of the centrality of whiteness in thought, and maybe perhaps specifically in art historical and humanistic thought, where whiteness is tacitly centered. And I just wanted to ask you, Cherise, and then this immediately opens, I think, to several of the others who just spoke. You know, many of us and many of those who just spoke are write and speak in a way that's critical of universalism, right? Of the principle that there's essentially one kind of human being, because that kind of human being was historically presumed to have certain specific characteristics and not others. This is the opening question I want to ask, is our desire to abandon certain tendencies of universalism, and I have you in mind, Alan, is our desire to abandon certain tendencies of universalism also fundamentally an abandonment of thinking about the human and humanism in general? In other words, another way to put it, Cherise, is, are you also on Michael's team here? Do you think that the abandoning of universalism means necessarily the abandonment of the centrality of the idea of the human being altogether in thought? So I turn it to you, Cherise, if you feel ready, but as you can see, I'm interested to hear from others who want to jump in as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, I mean, let me just back up a little bit. I am here at the Getty this year at the Getty Research Institute, and I am in, what is a monument to, what is a white monument to a white art history. It is interesting to think through how centrally that tenet remains in the art history that is practiced here. And so I'm kind of newly surprised, I will tell you, that the really, I think, important steps that the discipline has taken away from the centrality of whiteness is really still kind of staunchly here in place. Now, what, on the one hand, I can see that is a Getty phenomenon, but I think it is a problem with art history. And, that is something that I wrote in my remarks, that we are a field that discriminates and categorizes, and that is the very heart of what we do. Now, we do a lot of other things, but we're always weeding out, we're always separating out. And in some ways, I'm beginning to wonder if it's a kind of fundamental problem with our field and not merely with the kind of how we characterize people and understand their humanity. So why don't I stop there and then punt it to Alan or to Michael?
I guess I'm catching that punt. I wonder if the issue here is larger than just art history as a discipline, but involves a broader horizon or landscape of activism. And I'm totally sympathetic with, scrutinizing and critiquing unexamined claims about universalism and humanity. But it seems to me that a lot of activists, including some Black Lives Matter activists, use the word human and humanity routinely as a defense against racism and brutality, because they know that in the minds of white supremacists, people of color are not yet human, or are not, or will never be human. And so I worry about abandoning the terminology, the sort of rhetoric of the human completely. I get it from a sort of academic point of view, and I would like to move beyond it. I really don't like humanism. Panofsky wrote this famous essay in the 40s about art history as a humanistic discipline. And he wrote that in response to, like fascism in Europe. But in doing so, he kind of institutionalized what Cherise is talking about, this sort of arch humanism of art history as a discipline. But I keep thinking about the folks who are not art historians and are not academics, who need the human as a kind of bargaining chip or argument. It's a little like the dilemma I encounter around the word nature, which I also really dislike ever since having read Tim Morton's book, The End of Nature, or excuse me, Ecology Without Nature, where he says that our cultural baggage about nature gets in the way of thinking ecologically because we bring all these romantic associations to it. And something analogous is happening with human, that it fosters uncritical, universalizing notions that line up with power and privilege. But there have also been activists and even a lot of scholars. Césaire even said famously, I want a humanism that is conceived with the true measure of humanity. And so that's kind of what I want to search for, probably idealistically. Let me punt to Michael, who will put us all straight.
Well, if only. I hear the worry about what we lose if we give up human as a category. It's been a valuable focus for thinking about consciousness, morality, the greater good. But I wonder if we can't have those things without also having this category human. Can't there be moral virtues that are appreciated, pursued, valued outside of being contained within the human as a organizing receptacle? I think as I think back to the conference that was the beginning of this volume, the conference in Paris long ago, and I came away from that and from reading the volume, it seems to me that all of the things that have been produced around the idea for the conference and the volume that is now called Humans had to do with whether our thinking should be human-centered or human-decentered. That was the basic question that kept coming up. And when I think about doing away with human as a category, that's basically what it's accomplishing. It's removing human from being a centering focus for thinking. I think that could be liberating. I think that could be progressive. I think we could still have the positive things that came from human-centered thinking moved into a new form if we take on this challenge.
Can I just add that since the conference, it has really shaped my thinking in the projects that I've done since. There's something about thinking through this really knotty topic that has stuck with me and differently calibrated my projects since.
I'm so glad to hear that. That's the highest praise I think an organizer of a conference could get. And I'm so glad that all of us had the chance to do that kind of thinking then, and it stuck with me, as I know it has with a number of others as well. Yeah, I mean, I think I see some interesting tensions where every once in a while, I think, most of the contributors to this volume are agreeing, and then I see moments when I think we're disagreeing. I mean, I'm tempted to say a couple things, but maybe the first one would just be, maybe it's more or less obvious that decentering the human being from our way of thinking about things is likely to have ecological benefits that could help in the fight against climate change. I think what's less certain is whether that decentering of the human being is also very helpful and needed now for the advance towards social justice and away from racialized forms of hierarchy and violence, and sexualized forms of hierarchy and violence. And I'm just curious to, hear responses. So I hope we'll hear from you, Caroline, too, when you're ready. But I see, Alan, you have your hand up. So please go jump in.
I'll make it brief, but I just wonder if, taking a cue from Michael about sort of thinking differently about agency would be helpful here. Instead of thinking about the human as a subject category, if we thought broadly in terms of justice, that could be applied everywhere. And by placing an emphasis on a particular subject category, we sort of divert attention, perhaps, from the notion of justice. And despite, what I said earlier about the category of human still and humanity still being useful to activists, it is possible to think about justice across all sorts of subject categories, because injustice is happening everywhere, including beyond the human species. As Michael rightly points out, we're annihilating life on Earth. We, of course, when I use the word we, that first person or third person plural always needs to be critically examined. But humans are not the only species suffering injustice, and there's plenty of injustice within the human species. So maybe the emphasis needs to be on justice. I'm struck by some interesting recent work by people like Claire Jean Kim and Bénédicte Boisseron and others who are trying to think about justice across species categories while also thinking critically about inequities within subject categories.
I would want to interject really here and to say that I feel an echo to some of the things that Alan says, where he's making a role for humanity. We could look at it from the point of view of responsibility, rather than from the point of view of interests, if you like. I think that a political project which veers away from a collective responsibility on the part of human beings to address whatever situation is unfolding is possibly a political project which is rendered less powerful or less effective. And so that sense of humanity being a kind of a baseline communal resource for the exercise of decision making and intervention. I can't really warm to a formulation that strips that away.
Jason, Lara, does either of you want a chance to jump in? Otherwise, I'll begin. We're beginning to get some questions in the chat, and I'm happy to turn to others. But I wanted to give you a chance to say something if you've been holding something before we do so.
No, let's do that. I think that would be great to to get to the questions in the chat, at least from my side. I think we should totally do that.
Great. Let me invite Jeanette. Do you? I can see you. I can see a photograph of you anyway. Do you want to ask your question?
Sorry, unmuting is always a good idea indeed. So what was my question? All right, so I think we were talking about two different things at once. It occurred to me. We were talking about kind of theorizing what it means to be human with all its implications in the history of philosophy. And we could also talk, or were to a degree, Alan brought it up, talking about the experiential dimension of being human. And call me pedestrian, but I think that the unique power of being human lies in this experiential dimension that we can't very well leave behind, because we are human beings in a human shaped body. And I, to a degree, do not share all the doom and gloom. I think there is tremendous positive potential if we define and understand our existence as humans, related to one another in interaction with objects and the non-human and other things. If we understand that as powerful in terms of human empathy, and in terms of human collaboration, I think it's really something that we can't, and in fact should not, leave behind, sorry, Michael, with or without Foucault. So this is kind of like an appeal to the positive sides of what it means to be human, or what it can mean to be human.
Michael, unless you want to join in right away, I'll call another question. Do you have a thought on that, Michael?
No, I hear what Jeanette's saying, and yeah, I think it's I respect that view, and I'm just on the other side of the spectrum at the moment, or I've been on the other side of the spectrum for a while. It just seems like the possibility for destructive, disastrous behavior is greater than the possibility for, or than the likelihood of constructive that would come from hanging on to this category as a focus for planning.
But is that an experience you also have in interactions with others on the experiential level?
Do you mean, do I relate to certain people? I absolutely do.
No, that there is more negatives to it than positives.
Well, no, I mean, I have wonderful relationships with dogs, with books, and with people. And and yes, some of the relationships, because I guess, of course, some of the relationships with people are especially dense and deep and complex. But that's I don't want to base a philosophical principle on that. I want a sounder, broader practice of thinking to hang my behavior on.
Could I jump in again and say that I definitely do not embrace or espouse an exceptionalist view of human beings as somehow, divinely ordained or special within, the wild kingdom. We are a species among species. And I totally agree with Michael about needing to see other animals as beings, as subjects worthy of ethical consideration, especially as we human beings differentially annihilate them. I'm merely holding out for the human and the humanity as categories for kind of pragmatic, rhetorical reasons in a political situation now that requires that in order for some people to fight against racism. I'm not defending a kind of exceptionalist view of the human species.
And I didn't mean to imply that. I was just coming back to your, the reference to activism, and that's where I thought there is a real active experiential component in that, in your argument as well.
Speaking of activism, we have a question about the relationship of scholarship to activism from Lee Flamand.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for these great talks. I hope you can hear me. So I guess my question kind of grows out of being an early career scholar, right? And thinking a little bit about what it is we're doing and where to go in terms of future work. So I often kind of think about, what Alan said kind of was interesting in terms of the use of the term human as a kind of useful tool on the streets or in the media, right? In terms of making claims for recognition and claims for, reparation and things like that. But then it kind of always makes me think about, what is our kind of particular contribution and role as scholars, right? Do we, if we want to kind of push past certain categories and kind of rethink universalisms, what is our kind of, what in other words is the kind of call on us, right? Like, is our job kind of, in a sense, to plant the seeds of a kind of better thinking for generations or whatever to come? And does that kind of mean that we need to maintain a certain amount of passivity or a certain amount of distance? Or is it, is that, sometimes I wonder, like, or should we be more often, going out, it's just less time in the books and more time on the streets, right? This is just something that I wrestle with personally. And I thought it kind of came out in especially Alan's talks, but also in other talks as well. I'm just interested in if you guys have thought about this yourselves, and if so, what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Could I start with an answer to this one? I teach a class pretty regularly that's called Historicizing the Politics of Identity. And in the first couple of times that I taught it, I began in the 1960s with Black Power and with definitions of Blackness, and having that identity position be the basis for advocating for representation, for making art, etc. And then a few years ago, I changed the structure of the course so that whiteness was the very first identity position that was considered, and then the rest, regardless of kind of chronology, proceeded from there. And part of the reason why I did that was about how definitions of self have whiteness at their center, but the kind of more important reason that I did that was to have all of us keep in mind that we're always working from an identity position, and we're always working within politics. And so I say that because whether you imagine that you are working from a politics or not, you are, and that there are many ways to be engaged. And I suppose because my practice is in American art and within fields of Black studies and art histories of minoritized people, especially how power is used by and against people, I feel like I have a mission-driven practice. And, that comes down to the scholarship that I create, the products like this gallery that I have an image of behind me that I have created, the students that I train that go on to make ethical scholarship and do ethical things out in the world and change art history among other places. So I suppose I firmly believe that there are many ways to make a difference, and that it isn't always about being in the street, but that's just my way of practicing.
I can jump in here if I may, and say that I'm a big believer in planting seeds in the new generation and seeing where they go. I've been teaching for a long time now, and I've found that there are things that I can't do, some conceptual leaps I can't make that my students can when they're presented with certain problems and they're working across disciplines, across categories, across boundaries. And I think that's a place where I see a great deal of hope.
I'll say, I don't know if others on the panel or authors or anyone else assembled, wants to answer this, but I'll say too that I think I feel more faith now than I did 10 years ago in the fact that fundamental ideas really do change. And that any kind of change has many different agents and many different elements. But that the classroom is one. There's a real lever there, I think, for remaking thought. And I see it. I see it in the students as well. So, yeah, I guess I'm really just agreeing with the last two remarks.
I want to add some thoughts about my. I agree with this kind of also kind of struggling, wrestling, with attachments to the term or discarding it and so on. And what I find in my own, probably at the core of my own attachment to the term, and I'm part of the camp that like sees problems with the universality, but then always kind of also at the same time, and Michael, we've had this discussion, like over a long time. And so I'm always more on the sides of of those who, who some want to hold on to the idea. And I think part of the reason comes from kind of thinking about art making, like the need of expression and the kind of making of art, the use of art as something that is not individualistic, but a kind of collective, like weighing of, like form of doing and making a practice that connects us, collectively and, like with all of the other actors that are out there, with all of the actors that are out there, with the environment that positions us and all of that. And so I find it very hard to think of art without art making, without linking it to a particular disposition about being in the world that for me is the easiest to think about as human. And that then also helps me, of kind of defining, a collectivity that, that struggles with, like issues of connecting with one another and the world out there in a similar fashion. And of course, one could find other, terms, other concepts to do that. But for me, I always discover that is, just so crucial to my own attachment, and something that, I find hard to replace, if I discard that. And of course, all of the, the guilt, all of the problems that come, and that was so, poignantly addressed. That's part of it, the term manner, and also part of the doing and making that was inspired by that term. But that's at least part of my own attachment to it, I guess.
Are there other thoughts or people who want? You can just raise your digital hand, or actually your real human hand, if you like. We have just a couple of more minutes before we close, and I wonder if there are any thoughts or questions. Maybe, I know there's some graduate students here, other younger scholars who have issues or questions they want to bring before we close. Alan, I see you're not a graduate student anymore, are you, Alan? No, please go ahead. Just teasing. Please go ahead, Alan. I'd love to have you join.
Oh, Alan Wallach, yeah.
I think you're still muted, Alan.
Thank you. Throughout the presentations, I didn't hear the word capitalism. Is the era in which we live the Anthropocene, which implies all humans are responsible for the climate emergency, or are we in the Capitalocene, as Andreas Malm and others argue? And if we are now living in the Capitalocene, then we need to reorient our thinking regarding the way the world is now organized, with its hierarchies and inequalities and hyper-exploitation, a world that is run, crudely speaking, by petro-criminals and their enablers?
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
So, Alan, do you want to make the capitalist exploiters non-humans and the rest of us can be humans?
No. Although you could say to the extent that human has been equated with whiteness, that's close. But it's not making one group human and another group not. And when I first thought of, since I wrote this out, I thought to put the word anthros in quotes to suggest, well, we're part of the primate species, a primate species. I mean, there is, I mean, I agree with you, Michael, that there are tremendous problems with the term human and the legacy of Panofsky and others. But what I'm saying is that really my point is about the way the world is now structured and the cultures that have in a sense, been created in response to or as part of that structure of oppression and exploitation. And that when we begin even to talk about art, art exists not outside of it or with the good wishes of the artist, it exists within these very structures. And therefore, thinking about anthro-being, or however you want to put it, means that you do have to refer to, you do have to have a sense of what those larger structures are and why they function the way they do. And I agree with you that there is a great hope to be had in the militancy and awareness of the young. But I also think that the young are, I'm happy to think that the young are beginning to catch on to the fact that the issues have to do with those larger structures of exploitation and oppression, and the fact that we do live with this regime of petro-criminals who are delighting, shall we say, delighting may be too strong, but are very happy to destroy all species in the quest for profit for the next quarterly report. And we see it going on right now when when the people who, governments that have made mild gestures towards maybe doing something about the climate emergency have thrown it overboard in the face of the Ukraine war. I think keeping these frameworks in mind is very important. That's why I say we need to think about capitalism, which is a worldwide system. And it's a system in which we find ourselves and a system in which we live.
Yeah, I just, because we're right up against time, I'm going to turn things over in just a second to Jason, who will close our meeting. But I want to just express thanks to you, Alan Wallach, for that set of remarks. I mean, I think one way, two things that come out of it that maybe we can just have in mind as we close is, Alan Braddock in his essay makes a wonderful reference to the kind of problem of the critique of the concept of the Anthropocene, that is, that it places blame on everyone instead of on those who are truly at fault, from which I think Alan Braddock makes a really wonderful retort that, yes, of course, we need to assign blame to those who are most responsible. while also maintaining the ability to think as a species and even beyond a species as a globe. But I also just want to say quickly, I absolutely agree that, you know, as we focus on social justice and as we focus on sustainability, we do run the risk, if we drop out class language and we drop out language about economic system, that we are ignoring a major piece of the problems of the present. So I just want to let's quickly say thanks, and then maybe I'll turn things back over to my co-editors for our close. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, authors, speakers. Thank you, audience members. Thank you again to our hosts and sponsors in the Center for Ideas in Society. We're at time's end, and I think about all I can say, and it gives me some hope from this productive, frustrating, thought-provoking, generative conversation, is it strikes me that the future of the human being is not yet a settled matter. And I think we can leave it at that and know that the book, which in light of Alan's strong statement, I'm not going to tell you to go buy, but nevertheless, the book is out there, filled with wonderful thoughts by wonderful authors, and the conversations are here before us, and they're continuing, I think, with necessity into the future. So thank you all for being here very, very much.